This episode includes descriptions of the violence of the transatlantic slave trade, so please take care while listening. It's summertime in the 1930s, and two important things are happening in the Watts neighborhood outside Los Angeles. Simon Rodia, an Italian immigrant, is working on his towers. For years, he spent nearly every day constructing looming towers from scrap rebar, concrete, and wire mesh. And as he works, a young girl named Betty occasionally walks by with her grandmother. She'll observe Rodia attach seashells and mirrors and other found objects to these towers, building altars to this neighborhood that existed on the economic and social margins of Los Angeles. And she's curious. She watches him take discarded found objects and put them on reverential display. She observes him creating art out of his surroundings. And from there, she learns what it means to be an artist. Nearly 60 years later, in a poem published in conjunction with her exhibition, Ritual and Remembrance, at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, Betye Saar writes, "There persists a longing to connect to my roots. I have a vague yearning for secret ceremonies and a haunting emptiness for lost-like ends. To fill the void, my art becomes an explorer, a tracer of forgotten tribes, a seeker of clues to feelings. I sift through the remnants of the ashes of time. The mystery of the unknown is my guide. These works are what I leave behind." Welcome back to Tomorrow is the Problem, a podcast from ICA Miami's Art and Research Center. I'm your host, Donna Honarpische, and in this episode, we will dive deep into the artistic production of the American artist Betye Saar, whose decades-long work across various mediums provides a way to understand how art assemblages become sites of power, offering, and reclamation. Long before Betye Saar's first exhibition or installation, she collected objects, almost as a ritualistic practice.
My favorite place to look for objects to use in my art is the flea market or the swap meet. I look this way and I look that way, and there's a little box that says, "Come over here and look inside of me."
Growing up, she collected and repaired ephemera and made collages from materials around her home. Later, she would scour flea markets and antique stores. But she wasn't looking for pretty knickknacks. She was looking for artifacts that reflected histories of racism and slavery. Artifacts that carried an energy or a spirit.
She's encountering these really intense objects of anti-Black racism, of stereotype, of mimicry, and she's taking them off the shelves, right? She's purchasing them in order to protect them in many ways, to prevent them from being circulated.
This is Sampara Aranca, an assistant professor in the Art History, Theory, and Criticism Department at the School of the Arts Institute, Chicago, and director of the Mellon Archives Innovation Programs for Rebuild Foundation.
The first time I encountered Betye Saar's work was, her quite famous now Aunt Jemima piece. She takes the stereotypical doll figurine of a mammy that features really intensely violent racist iconography that includes blackface. She places it inside a kind of box where the wallpaper is the advertisement of what used to be, right, Aunt Jemima kind of pancake mix or flour mix. And then that doll is holding in one hand a broom and in the other a gun, and then is also framed with, kind of propped up against her body, is another kind of image, what looks like a painting of a Black woman who is what we gather to be the nurse of or the caretaker of a white baby. And on the floor, there's strewn cotton.
This piece that Aranca is describing, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, is one of Saar's most seminal works, where Saar turns a negative, stereotypical portrayal of a Black woman into a figure of revolutionary power. Angela Davis even credited it with launching the Black women's movement. But the liberation of Aunt Jemima is just one example of Saar's groundbreaking work in mixed media assemblage, an art form similar to three-dimensional collage, often made out of found objects. There were others working in assemblage, like Joseph Cornell, whose work inspired Saar. And her early memories of watching Simon Rodia build the Watts Towers never left her. But it was the formal merging of assemblage with Black imagery that really set Saar apart as a creative force in the Black arts, and even more in Black feminist arts.
She's working in a visual vocabulary in the 1970s, in a time when it is not cool, not cutting edge, right? Not avant-garde to work with found objects, what are thought to be kind of like, detritus, trash, in the way that she's doing it. Towards the end of researching my book, I focused on kind of 3 murders of Black Panthers between 68 and 71 and the kind of visual cultural objects. Political posters, newspapers, print media, documentary film, right? The visual culture that emerged out of those deaths as a way to rethink them as generative political possibilities. Towards the end of the research for that book, I returned to Saar in many ways, right? Because Saar, along with artists like David Hammons, Senga Ngudi, Faith Ringgold, artists who, thank goodness, are getting their due in a lot of ways, right, in the past 15 years. These are artists who were engaging in a Black radical aesthetic, but didn't necessarily join the Black Panther Party as members because they didn't necessarily want their art to fall under certain kind of party lines. But they also weren't fully embraced by a kind of like avant-garde or white experimental art world, right? So they started creating their own aesthetic.
Saar saw power in certain objects and magic in the ways they could be reclaimed, assembled, and displayed.
In Saar's work, there is a deep resonance, commitment to this idea of like energy, like the embodiment, the enactment of the sacred and the spiritual, but also of the like banal and quotidian, the boring stuff of every day, that there's something that's in that could be transformative. One of the origin stories that accompanies why Saar starts working with objects in this way, and it's that story of her and David Hammons in 1970 going to the Art Institute of Chicago and encountering these objects from the continent.
Inside the exhibit, Saar was initially struck by the way this collection of African objects were displayed. Illuminated with spotlights inside a dark, cavernous space, they seemed almost suspended in space and time.
There's this 1990 interview with Karen Ann Mason where Saar kind of reflects on this museum visit with Hammond. Saar says, quote, "The thing that I think of that's the strongest piece that affected both my work and David Hammons' work was a robe of an African chief. The robe was just a rectangle of fabric folded over with an opening cut out for the head. This piece of fabric was quite amazing because it had a pattern. And when you looked closely, you could see the pattern was composed of a little bit of hair that was made into a hairball and sewn into this cloak. It was so powerful because not only was it a rough fabric and beautiful to look at, but it had a little bit of everybody on it. For me, even in a glass display case, it was almost like an electrical shock that came through that display." That to me like embodies this idea of energy, right? Of the way that objects can just become activated, can just like push through the limited conditions of how they're shown, of how they're displayed. But it also speaks precisely to this kind of transformative capacity that she's able to encounter this object, pay attention to the way that hair is sewn into it, right? And that object explodes out of its captivity.
Saar's process of collecting objects and creating assemblage pieces expanded beyond her American surroundings into the broader circuit of objects, artifacts, and rituals from the African diaspora.
That was really kind of an epiphany for her in how she wanted to continue making art, which is kind of equally as political, but more spiritually charged and more thinking about also African ways of making art.
This is Stephanie Seidel, a curator at ICA Miami. She curated an exhibition on Betye Saar titled Serious Moonlight in 2021, which is the first time that many of Saar's larger installations have been shown in decades.
Betty traveled to Haiti for the first time in 1974, and she went a second time in 1978. And she was particularly interested in seeing what ritual and ritual practices looked like in Haiti at the time.
In Haiti, Saar sketched gravestones, learned about voodoo practices, and collaborated with sequin artists. She brought back a new relationship to ritual and spiritual objects. At the same time, her wall-mounted assemblages expanded into room-size installations, influenced by this new encounter with Afro-Caribbean rituals.
One of the installations is called House of Fortune, and that installation in particular is a room that is painted dark blue, and within the room we find a table with 4 chairs. This table is set into palm fronds on the ground, surrounded by tarot cards. So there's this kind of imagined gathering of people around the table. Then there's the sequin flags, which originally come from a tradition of Haitian voodoo, where they were made in the 1940s, roughly, to adorn voodoo temples. So it's very much visually embedded into ritual practice.
Saar's use of objects like the sequin flags she discovered in Haiti reflected a movement in which objects typically only found in spiritual or ritualistic settings were now brought into popular art. In this way, Saar's work is not simply something to be seen, but serves as an active portal to be experienced.
So ritual is something that is very prominent in her installations in particular, and actually her first exhibition of installations at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1980 was titled Ritual. And in the catalog for the show, she actually published a short statement, or almost like a poem, where she defines what ritual means to her. And she says, "The act of making art for me is a ritual," which is kind of a prescribed series of set or acts. And for her, that's kind of the procedure of making the work is a ritual in itself. And she defines it very clearly into different steps, where she says there's the imprint, the search, the recycling and transformation, and the release of the work. And that is all part of the ritual.
1. Imprint.
So imprint includes gathering ideas, thoughts, memories, dreams.
2. Search.
The search is really kind of trying to find objects. She works a lot with found objects, and she might find them at a flea market or somewhere in nature.
3. Recycling and transformation.
Then transforming them through kind of bringing them into the context of an assemblage, maybe painting them, adding glue or something to kind of create a new context for the materials.
And 4. Release.
Which means the work is shared. And so the work is not complete until it's not received by an audience. And the installations make that very obvious, because it is the visitor who enters the work and kind of inserts their own body into the context and kind of reacts to the environment.
This last step of Saar's ritual, release, means that the display of her installations is just as dynamic for her as a creator as it is for her viewers, who activate their own personal experiences when encountering her work. These experiences go beyond even what Saar could have anticipated and may evoke other times, places, or worlds. Over time, her assemblages and installations have themselves become sites of ritual for audience members, many of whom move from being passive viewers to active participants.
So there is a form of the altar also in the exhibition in the work called Wings of Morning. And there's specifically the invitation to viewers to leave little offerings to people who have passed on, or people they want to remember. So there's this interactive moment, and it was actually surprising how quickly this kind of offerings grew over the course of the exhibition, and how many people brought really specific little items that might remember them of people. I saw like buttons or little pearls, little cards. And I think that is something Betye encourages and intends in the work. It's not so much specifically emulating Santeria or voodoo, but it's really creating this open invitation for people to interact. And some objects might resonate more with some people and others won't, but there's this openness and everybody brings different associations to the works, which makes them what they are.
By creating assemblages that incorporate spiritual forms like altars, shrines, and amulets, Saar brought rituals of everyday, specifically of African diasporic tradition, into the walls of the museum, transforming the relationship between art and ritual and expanding the experience of the viewer to access their own spiritual worlds.
Ooh, first of all, I love an altar. I love an altar.
This is Krista Franklin, a writer and contemporary artist based in Chicago.
I mean, I think that love came definitely from the Pentecostal church and people being called to the altar. So the altar has always been, to me, this site of repenting, calling out for help, right? Acceptance, admission of things. It's such a powerful site, in so many ways, and also acceptance and forgiveness. I definitely practice altar work in my own life. I have one in my home, and I spend time there. I spend time there meditating. I spend time there tending to that space, right? And really being about that disciplined work of connecting to my higher self, to my ancestors, to my dead, to God.
Franklin notes the deep relationship to ritual work present in Saar's works.
It's very much on the surface. It's not at all hidden. It's very, very direct. And many of them are incredibly beautiful, just aesthetically gorgeous as well. And troubling, too, as they should be. Frightening or formidable in some senses. Not just beauty, but also like ferocious, kind of ferocity to it, which I think is also, a reclamation of power, a reclamation of wholeness of our spirits, of reclaiming our bodies, reclaiming ourselves, reclaiming our histories, reclaiming our ancestors who had to suffer through so much, and honoring them and all that they had to endure so that we could be here.
Like Betye Saar, much of Franklin's art combines found images and objects of Black culture, African diaspora, and histories of enslavement, remediating them for the viewer and drawing new associations and rich interconnections between various moments in time.
There's a particular work titled Voyage Whose Chartings Are Unlove. Voyage Whose Chartings Are Unlove is an installation that I created using an aquarium and an altered book and a chain and some aquarium plant life, sand and such. I made this when I was in graduate school, and it was an attempt to think through the complicated relationship that African Americans have had around literacy. It was about literacy and illiteracy. And the book that I used for the altered book was John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom.
Franklin then used a laser cutter to carve the infamous Brookes slave ship diagram into the book's pages.
That's a very iconic image of how the early human traffickers mapped out how they were going to stack bodies in a ship. So I decided to take this map and laser cut it into the pages that I took apart the book. Laser cut the image in the pages, and I reassembled the book. And I was going to submerge it in the tank of water, thinking very much about the bodies who were thrown overboard on the slave ships, people who jumped off the slave ships because they didn't know where they were going and they did not want to go. People who sacrificed their lives, sacrificed their children's lives, who basically threw themselves to the sharks because the sharks would always be following because they could smell the carnage.
The title of Franklin's piece, A Voyage Whose Chartings Are Unloved, is a reference to Robert Hayden's poem, Middle Passage. He writes,
sails flashing to the wind like weapons, sharks following the moans, the fever, and the dying, horror, the corpuscent, and compass rose, middle passage, voyage through death to life upon these shores.
So I was thinking through that with this project, and I remember when I went to install it and I had not done a test run in my studio. I just was like, I'm going to take the book there. I'm going to fill it up with water, the tank. I'm going to put it in the water. It's going to be this beautiful image, whatever. Well, when I put the book in the water, of course it floated to the top. And I had the most visceral sadness that came over me because that was really my first encounter of thinking about the book as a body. And when I really thought through the logistics of water, bodies floating to the top, that I had to then sadly and kind of psychologically traumatizing to myself, use a chain to hold the book at the bottom of the tank so that it wouldn't keep floating, that was even more traumatic. So it was almost like I was reenacting these crimes, right, in a way. And that wasn't my intention when I sought to create the work. But what it did do was it deepened my understanding of just something that was just an idea to me. This isn't an idea. This was actually something that happened. This was an occurrence. And if you want to reenact it, then let's get to the horror of it, you know? So I really spent a lot of time in that installation sobbing, going to the bathroom and crying. I was realizing what I had done, what I had made, what I had recreated. It lives on as a photograph, which is, I would say, a very beautiful photograph.
Franklin's art practice, like Saar's, activates memories of the past and summons the feelings around them.
And visually, it looks very gorgeous. You know, it's visually, aesthetically pleasing to the eye, but it's also terrifying. I learned a really deep lesson that day in thinking through what you're asking me about the transatlantic slave trade and the logistics, the day-to-day, the actual work that went into that and the pain kind of exploded some things in my mind. That to me was a ritual of understanding some of the specificities of an idea that I had about slaves at the bottom of the ocean, enslaved Africans, at the bottom of the ocean. Africans who had been abducted, who had chosen not to be enslaved, and what they had to endure in the sea.
Betye Saar writes of this connection to the pain of her ancestors in this poem.
I cast a long shadow. Backwards, my spirits wander. From Willow Glen Gardens to Zigzag to Louisiana, to Iowa, to Missouri, to Virginia's shores. Blue illusions beckon and my spirits sail. Some to Irish seas and some crawl deep into the belly of a slave ship. In search of the unknown, my spirits pass through the spirit door, to seek the dark corner of the ancestral chair, to breathe on the embers of Africa and recall the memory of fire.
Like Franklin, Betye Saar uses installation to evoke a visceral and unflinching understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. Sampata Aranka, who we heard from earlier, draws our attention to the ways that both artists have invoked the same image of the Brookes slave ship to bring the past into the present and the present into the past.
Troubled waters What you tend to have, right, in iterations of this installation is a kind of canoe that is often suspended with these kind of hands reaching up out of this canoe ship. Often there are these kind of blues, like blues so deep they almost look black in their formation. And underneath, you have a reproduction that scales to the length of the canoe. You have a reproduction of the Brookes slave ship map, right, which is originally was a kind of rendering that was used in abolitionist causes that has this kind of troubled history, because even while the Brookes slave ship was circulated as an example of the overwhelming conditions of violence, right, that was required of Black people as they endured the journey across the Middle Passage, right? It also, in its reproduction, recapitulates the very violence that it's trying to undo, right? So despite the best intentions, what ends up happening is a circulation of this image, and I'll describe it, of what Black people had to endure in this kind of human trafficking that was transatlantic slave trade. The map of the Brookes slave ship shows the kind of ways that Black people were held captive in the hold of the ship. And what you see in this image is this incredibly claustrophobic space, this space of little to no ability for movement or mobility. You also see the kind of violences on a graphic scale. It is also about this vessel, this canoe that serves as a vessel that holds, suspended over in suspension in this kind of liminal space in between, right? But it also is a vessel that contains these, surrogates of life, these hands that reach up and out of the structures of violence that contain it, right, towards another kind of possibility. I feel like this is exactly the poetic kind of mysticism, the poetic energy that Saar is working with, right? How do we think about the violences that form us, that form the experience of everyday life, without merely reducing Black life to those violences, right? By suggesting another way, another set of sensations.
Franklin sits within a lineage of Betye Saar's work, not only in her grappling with the African diaspora, but also in the evocation of power through reclaimed and reassembled images. Franklin's chosen mediums move between writing and visual art, sometimes overlapping the two. She has been described as part of a lineage of Afrofuturism and Afro-surrealism, incorporating techniques of collage while playing with color, narrative, and popular figures and images of Black aesthetics.
I kind of made my name on creating these iconography images, right? Dealing with Black iconography, historical images and figures. And it really was, for me, a kind of act of veneration. It was an ancestral veneration. It was about me holding these individuals as almost like a sainthood, figures of power and influence that had a lot of resonance for generations before me, that really influenced the way that I thought. And for me, it was really about like remembering, acts of remembrance and acts of praise, because people had gone through so much in terms of me like keeping figures intact in the work. I don't know if that's was so much purposeful at the beginning. I think it was because I was learning the art of collage and learning my own style. Keeping things whole was just a part of what I was doing at that time. But I do think that there was possibly a subconscious understanding about the disembodied, about pain, mutilation, physical destruction that had been done to Black folks and continues to be done and filmed. At this point, photographed. I think it was about me trying to reclaim the wholeness of the Black body. Definitely, sometimes there are some works of mine that I definitely for lack of a better word, have activated to do a certain thing or to have a certain energy to it that touches on a historical events or individuals from history, which then, of course, calls upon the dead, calls upon people who have transitioned and who are no longer in the physical realm. And I think that sometimes when we activate those kinds of symbologies, those images, even if they are benign images, you know what I mean? Just like a photograph of somebody, it still carries within it a power. It carries within it a resonance, an echo of the past. And so there are pieces that I have that people have come to me and said that they have certain memories that are triggered when they look at it. It's activated. It's not something that I even necessarily was attempting to do to them, but trying to do for myself or trying to activate inside of their work or think through. A lot of my work is really about thinking through things, thinking through historical events, thinking through figures who are very influential in my own imagination. So it's a methodology of understanding, which I think ritual in general is a methodology of understanding, a methodology of healing, and of power.
As we look towards ritual as a methodology of healing and power, Sampata Aranka emphasizes that ritual is not only oriented towards the past.
I hope that by learning with Saar, by learning with Krista Franklin, right, and other artists who deploy these methods, I hope that listeners know that these practices, these kind of Black radical aesthetic feminist practices, are future-oriented, right? They're predictive. That ritual is something that is about prediction as much as it's about the past, that it's about a future orientation. It's a giving, it's a generosity for those that will be here when we're not. Saar and Franklin, I think, embody that in their practices.
While both Saar and Franklin are artists who care deeply about the materials they work with, reclaiming and remediating popular images for the viewer to reconsider issues of race and gender, both are equally invested in what it means to see art as a portal, as a passage into the unknown, where the past meets the present, or as an open space to dream of other possible worlds. Join us next time when we'll discuss the art and poetics of the late artist Etel Adnan, whose work across political and geographic contexts offers a ritual of seeing. Tomorrow is the Problem is produced in partnership with Podfly Productions. This episode was written and produced by Aubrey Calloway and me, Donna Honarpiche. Our executive producer is Jocelyn Aram. Our recording engineer is Carlay Reem Neal. Our sound designer is Nina Pollack. Special thanks to Sampata Aranka, Stephanie Seidel, and Krista Franklin for joining us on the show. I'm Donna Honarpiche. Thanks for listening.